Crime and the Changing Forms of Class Control, Policing Public Order in Toronto the Good, 1859 to 1955. What is the role of policing in society? Should police be reactive and catch criminals, or should they be proactive and try to prevent crimes from happening and criminals from becoming criminals? In the first part of this lesson, we examine policing in Toronto, examine to what extent the Toronto Police Force went from a focus on public morality in the 19th century to a modern crime-solving and crime-apprehending force by the mid-20th century. Changes in crime rates do not necessarily reflect changes in the actual incidence of criminal behavior. As noted in a previous lesson, there is usually a difference between the number of crimes occurring and the number recorded. One reason why crime rates could change without actual incidences changing could be a change in the behavior or actions that are considered a crime, a wider definition for the same action. Another reason could be a change in police behavior. Police could become more efficient and effective in detecting crimes with new technologies, patrol cars, radios, GPS, etc. And police could simply put more resources into going after certain types of criminals and crimes. Borich and Hagen, in this study of policing in Toronto over nearly a century, examined the nature of policing to see if the Toronto force fit a generally assumed pattern that as police forces in North America became more professionalized, they went from a more class control to more crime control policing. One of the benefits of the study is the long time span taken, 1859 to 1955, which allows for greater understanding of change over time. This model of policing change was the view of Eric Monkkonen, a historian of urban crime. Monkkonen studied arrest trends in 23 U.S. cities between 1860 and 1920, essentially during the urban reform era discussed in a previous lesson. Monkkonen's thesis was that during this period there was a shift in police organization and priorities as municipal police forces shifted from focusing on public order offenses, often moral issues such as public drunkenness, to an emphasis on prevention and control of more serious crimes against persons and property, for example, theft and assault. According to Monkkonen, there were two eras of policing. The first was the class control policing, roughly 1860 to 1890. This era of policing was characterized by action, or proaction, against public order offenses such as public drunkenness and disorderly conduct, considered largely quote-unquote victimless crimes. Illustrating the hegemonic function of the law, this form of policing was focused on the working class. The police, therefore, are seen as enforcing particular sets of laws that helped uphold middle-class values. You might raise the objection that drinking itself is hardly just a working-class social activity, so how can it be argued that public drunkenness was a working-class problem? In answer to this, it can be pointed out that a key difference was that the middle and upper classes had nicer and larger homes in which to entertain, as well as clubs and so on, whereas more ordinary working persons, who maybe lived in one or two rooms, perhaps with a large family, were much less able to entertain. You might also object that if the middle and upper classes are out socializing at their club or someone else's home, then they would be in public and possibly open to arrest for public drunkenness. Without attempting to comment on drinking habits and quantities of persons at the time, it could be pointed out that the upper classes could more likely afford carriages and taxis and so on than those without the means, who would have to walk and would therefore be in the streets, coming from identifiable areas of working class socializing. During this era, middle class opinion put pressure on civil authorities to monitor or control working class activity. Police forces therefore focused their attention and resources on monitoring the behavior of the working class, on immigrants and so on, populations thought to be potential problems in terms of morality. Police, in this sense, were monitoring public morality by enforcing public order laws. Indicative of the social role, police forces during this period also had social welfare functions such as administering censuses and enforcing public health standards. The second era, crime control policing, circa 1890 to 1920. During this era, there was increased focus on detecting and obtaining crime arrests. This was a shift from predominantly arresting people for public order offenses. According to Monkkonen, the shift from class control to crime control can largely be attributed to three factors. 1. Technological innovations in police work. 2. Shift in the structure of city governments. And 3. Removal of social service function of police. Technological innovations allowed police to change the way they did their work. Patrolling the streets with police constables is a sound method of community policing to both reinforce the presence of police in the city and thereby assuage the fears of residents, and also to hopefully reduce instances of crime because of a visible police presence. A shift in police resources, however, allowed for more detectives to be employed, and the detectives would spend their time on more serious offenses than public order offenses such as public drunkenness. Some of the technological innovations included improved communications. Police signal boxes contained a telephone linked directly to the local police station, allowing officers on the beat to keep in contact with the station, reporting anything unusual, requesting help if necessary, or even to detain prisoners until a vehicle could be sent to transport them to the station or to jail. In terms of crime detection and identification, the Bertillon system helped police identify and classify offenders. Developed by French inventor Alphonse Bertillon, the system allowed the recording and identifying of persons based on physical and personality characteristics. Body measurements of suspects would be taken, and individual markings such as tattoos and scars would be recorded in a photograph taken for future use when police were involved in a criminal investigation. The benefit was that by arranging the records carefully, it would be very easy to sift through a large number of records quickly, given a few measurements from the person to be identified. While it might not always give an exact match, it would allow one to narrow the pool of possible people, and then to compare the person with a photograph. Changes in the structure of city governments shaped policing as well. City governments became more centralized, more specialized, and more bureaucratic. So too did the police forces. As city governments became more businesslike, police forces followed, and this entrepreneurial model of policing, which increasingly focused on efficiency, forced police forces to consider how best to use their human power resources in the prevention and detection of crimes. With these changes to city government, many of the social service functions of police forces were taken over by the city government. The creation and expansion of various government welfare and service agencies meant that police forces no longer had to allocate resources to these matters and could focus more attention on the detecting and arresting of criminals. Thus, according to Munkanen, there was a shift from class to crime control in North American cities during this period. Borich and Hagen, however, challenged this thesis in regards to Toronto, in particular what they see as a too narrow understanding of class control, arguing that a decline in arrests for traditional forms of public order issues cannot necessarily be taken as direct evidence for a shift from a class control to a crime control model. In the case of Toronto, there was not a shift from class to crime control, but rather an expansion of what was considered public order and therefore class control issues. The enactment and enforcement of city bylaws helped enforce the social order and public morality. City bylaws, generally considered to concern largely quote-unquote victimless crimes and minor offenses, rely on the proactivity of police enforcement and reflected middle-class interests. Bylaws represented the social control and influence of middle-class values to regulate working-class morality, recreation, and economic activity. This included the regulation of hours and location of dance halls, movie theaters, and billiards halls, sites of working-class recreation and middle-class concern. There is a geospatial factor here as well. As with suburbanization, middle classes moved further away from the city center to outlying areas, and the city center became predominantly working-class and immigrant areas. Thus, having a localized area in which to target working-class morality would make it easier for the police force to proactively enforce bylaws that upheld middle-class concerns.
The Irish Model in 19th Century Canadian Policing. In Greg Marquise's article on the influence of the Irish model of policing on 19th century Canadian policing, he begins by raising a point about a growing number of studies examining policing within an imperial context. The point here, and which fits with Marquise's comparison of Irish and Canadian policing in the 19th century, is to remember the context of 19th century Canadian and Irish history. Canada, or British North America, as well as Ireland were part of the British Empire, ruled from London, England. Thus, looking at policing in Canada, it is natural to look for parallels and influences elsewhere in the British Empire. Policing in a colonial context has more to it than simply catching bad guys and keeping the public peace. A significant similarity between the Northwest Mounted Police and the Royal Irish Constabulary was that each had a similar purpose of securing territory and populations on behalf of the state. Now, Ireland and Canada in the 19th century were very different in many respects. Ireland had a long recorded history and connection to Britain, and had been a colony of England since the 1500s. And in fact, Ireland was joined with Britain in a legislative union in 1800 to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, or the UK. Canada, on the other hand, had been an English colony only since the mid-1700s, was underpopulated, and the state or central government did not control all the territory. However, as discussed in Marquise's article, state police, the Northwest Mounted Police, or the Royal Irish Constabulary, were important in extending control of the state over regions and populations who were either considered lawless or did not respect the legitimacy of the state. In Ireland, for example, large segments of the society did not accept the legitimacy of British rule in Ireland, and showed this by making life very difficult for government officials and administrators, through non-cooperation with the state on the one hand, and through acts of violence on the national level, rebellion, and local acts of violence in the countryside on the other. Indeed, Ireland under British rule had a reputation for lawlessness, what we might call communal justice. Because many in Ireland felt that they were oppressed by British rule, they often ignored or attempted to ignore state law, or what they might describe as British law or the law of their oppressor. Thus, throughout rural Ireland in the 19th century, there were widespread communal justice movements, which verged on vigilantism, and which sought to enforce a moral code that was often at odds with state law, particularly over issues such as having access to farms, being evicted from one's home, and so on. Thus, for the British state, policing in Ireland was integral to its ability to enforce law and stability, and thus the Royal Irish Constabulary was a pivotal enforcer and symbol of the state and British rule. The Northwest Mounted Police had a similar role in policing the western frontier and introducing elements of state rule into this territory. Although in the Northwest there was not the same issues as in Ireland of long-standing resistance to state rule that was seen as foreign and illegitimate, there were other similarities or parallels in that police operated often without the consent of the people, such as natives, American miners, and so on, over whom they enforced the law. Police could thus be seen as agents of cultural imperialism, enforcing new norms of behavior in territories that might have been more or less self-governing in the past. Whether in the sense of a native band enforcing its own codes and punishments, or with the example from the previous reading of the miners' meeting. Marquis argues that most of Canada in the 19th century was policed by forces which more or less had the consent of the community. What is clear from his discussion of policing in British Columbia and Newfoundland is that local conditions, settler population, how people made their living, and so on, were an important factor on the nature of local police forces and the relative success of policing and being accepted by the community. In most locales in 19th century Canada, police forces were under local political control, which usually meant greater acceptance by the community. It is precisely in another regard that the Irish model of policing was utilized in Canada and elsewhere in the British Empire. Where there was hostility to the state, or where the state did not adequately control the territory, or have many state institutions such as courts and jails, the Irish model was preferred. Within the British Empire, the Irish model of policing is often contrasted with the English model. In the English model, the police force is locally recruited, locally controlled, and unarmed. Historically, in England, people were wary of the encroachment of a strong state presence, and so armed, centrally controlled policing was not acceptable. In the Irish model, the police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, was purposefully centrally controlled, heavily armed, not locally recruited, and closer to a paramilitary force. In the Royal Irish Constabulary, for example, you were not allowed to serve in the country of your birth or where you were raised. Referring to the IRC as a paramilitary force points to the fact that it was like a cross between an army and a police force. personnel were heavily armed. They lived in isolated barracks in towns and in the countryside. The North West Mounted Police, therefore, were organized like the Royal Irish Constabulary. They were centrally controlled, well armed, and functioned like a paramilitary force. As noted in the Stone article in the previous reading, the North West Mounted Police were unlike the Royal Irish Constabulary and most other police forces in the British Empire, in that they acted both as policemen, but also as magistrates or judges, able to pass judgments on criminals as well as apprehending them.